Today, we will be looking at two horrifying caving stories that went horribly wrong. The first one in particular is about an instructor making a fatal assumption, putting not only his own life in danger, but also the 12 other kids alongside him. As for the second one, it's a dive that was meant to become a tragic disaster from the start. As always, viewer discretion is advised. On 9th April 2005, a young man named Richard Harness led an expedition of 12 eager children in the depths of one of the most notorious caves known as the Devil's Den Cave. At 20 years old, Richard believed himself experienced enough to guide this school field trip through the underground labyrinth beneath the Ozark Mountains. His previous visits to the cave system had given him confidence, perhaps too much of it. While Richard briefed the children, Melissa Jones, another instructor, remained outside as she waited for another group of children to lead later in the day. The temperature outside hovered around 68 degrees Fahrenheit, 20 degrees Celsius. But within the limestone passages, a constant 55 degrees Fahrenheit, 13 degrees Celsius, awaited them, cool enough to slowly sap body heat over hours of exposure. The children, ranging from 8 to 12 years old, moved excitedly as they donned their helmets and switched on their flashlights. None of them had been in a wild cave before. Their only experiences with underground spaces were commercial show caves with paved walkways and electric lighting. Richard carried a small backpack with water bottles, energy bars, a first aid kit, and extra batteries, standard preparations for a trip planned to last only 3 hours. What he hadn't accounted for was how his body had changed since his last expedition 6 months earlier. The 15 pounds, 6.8 kilograms, he'd gained during winter seemed insignificant when he volunteered to lead this adventure. By 11:30 a.m., the group had navigated through a series of increasingly challenging horizontal passages. The children's small frames allowed them to move with relative ease through tight spaces, where Richard had to exhale fully and contort his body to pass. Each successful navigation built a false sense of security. Their path led them to a particularly daunting obstacle, a vertical fissure, barely 10 inches, 25 centimeters wide, but extending upward about 6 feet, 1.8 meters. This narrow crack connected two horizontal passages in the cave system. Through his flashlight beam, Richard could see that the passage beyond was slightly larger, just enough space for someone of his stature to crawl on hands and knees. Richard mentally referred to this as a room, though it was merely a slightly more accommodating tunnel. His memory from previous explorations told him this space continued onward to more impressive portions of the cave. The fissure appeared passable, and Richard recalled traversing it before. He made a critical decision. He would send the children through first while he supervised, then follow them into the horizontal passage beyond. Through the beam of his light, he could see this passage on the other side, tantalizingly close, yet separated by the narrow vertical slot of limestone. One by one, the young explorers turned sideways and slipped through the narrow opening, their small bodies compressing as they navigated the tightest sections. Some made noises of discomfort as cold stone pressed against their ribs and spines, but all 12 eventually emerged into the horizontal passage beyond. Their excited movements were visible through the crack as they crawled forward on hands and knees into the space Richard had remembered, their flashlight beams dancing along the low ceiling. Richard turned sideways and began his own entry into the crack. Immediately, the unforgiving stone gripped him more tightly than he remembered, his chest pressed against one wall, his spine against the other. Still, he pushed forward, sucking in his stomach and inching deeper into the fissure. Halfway through, progress stopped. The passage narrowed imperceptibly, but enough that his hips, wider than his chest by several crucial centimeters, wouldn't pass through. He attempted to retreat, but found himself caught at an angle that made backward movement impossible. The rock held him in a vice-like grip, compressing his chest and restricting his breathing. The realization struck with terrifying clarity. He was completely stuck, wedged in solid limestone, with 12 children now trapped beyond his reach in the horizontal passage. The initial terror was overwhelming. Richard's heart hammered against the confining stone as pure primal fear flooded his system. His breathing, already restricted by the pressure on his chest, came in short, panicked gasps. In that moment, the full weight of his responsibility crashed down upon him. 12 children, none older than 12, were now cut off from safety because of his miscalculation. He had led them into danger, and now his own body formed the barrier that prevented their escape. On the other side of the fissure, the children's excitement transformed instantly into horror. Their young faces, once excited, contorted with fear as they watched their guide become trapped in solid rock. Some froze in place, paralyzed by the sudden turn of events. Others began to cry silently. The older children, processing the situation more quickly, crawled toward the fissure to assess Richard's condition. Through the narrow opening, they could see him suspended in the vertical crack, unable to move forward or backward. The sight of their adult protector helplessly pinned between walls of limestone shattered their sense of security. If Richard couldn't save himself, who would save them? Outside the cave, Melissa Jones checked her watch. The group wasn't due to return until 3 p.m., more than 3 hours away. Unaware of the emergency unfolding beneath the earth, she sat in the warm spring sunshine, occasionally glancing toward the cave entrance, expecting nothing but an on-time return. Inside, the first half hour passed in a blur of desperate attempts. Each movement only seemed to wedge him more firmly in place. His hips, slightly wider than he remembered from his last visit, formed an immovable anchor in the narrowest part of the fissure. The children watched in growing dismay as their guide's struggles proved futile. They could only watch as Richard's movements grew weaker, his breath more labored. By the 1 hour mark, the immediate panic had given way to a more insidious danger. The temperature in the cave began its slow assault on their bodies. Without movement to generate warmth, they all started to shiver. Richard, although in a desperate situation, still gave out instructions. He told them all to huddle together in order to fight the coldness inside the cave. For Richard, the physical situation deteriorated rapidly. His suspended legs, dangling below the point where he was wedged, began to tingle as circulation was compromised. The first signs of compression syndrome, a potentially fatal condition caused by prolonged pressure cutting off blood flow to tissues, were setting in. At the 2 hour mark, conditions inside the cave worsened substantially. The limited air supply in the confined space began to change in composition, as 12 children and 1 trapped adult consumed oxygen and exhaled carbon dioxide. The first sign of this deterioration came as headaches developed among the group. Then followed dizziness and nausea, the body's warning systems responding to the shifting atmospheric chemistry. Outside, unaware of the life-threatening situation developing below ground, Melissa Jones continued her wait. The appointed return time was still hours away. No help would be summoned until the group was officially overdue. By the 3rd hour, several children had become dangerously still. The children's water supply, meant for a short recreational trip, was already half consumed. Dehydration would soon compound the effects of the cold exposure, accelerating the drop in body temperature. 2 of the youngest had fallen asleep, despite the older children's efforts to keep them awake. This surrender to sleep was not benign rest, but a dangerous symptom of advancing hypothermia. At 3 p.m., the appointed return time passed with no sign of the group. Melissa Jones, now concerned, alerted park rangers about the overdue of the expedition. The search began, but precious hours had already elapsed, hours during which the trapped adventurers' conditions had deteriorated toward criticality. When rescuers finally located the group, they were in shock. Richard wedged tightly, almost out of strength, in the narrow vertical fissure between 2 horizontal passages. 12 kids, trapped beyond him with no way of reaching them, or even giving them supplies before getting Richard out of the way. The rescuers' initial attempts to free Richard proved disastrously ineffective. Park rangers and local firefighters without specialized cave rescue training attacked the stone with sledgehammers and chisels, attempting to break away enough rock to free him. The violent impact sent shockwaves through the limestone, threatening to destabilize the very fissure holding Richard. 1 ranger suffered a broken hand from a missed hammer strike, highlighting the dangers of improvised techniques in the confined space. 2 hours into the rescue attempt, the Washington County Search and Rescue Team arrived with proper cave rescue training. They immediately recognized the futility of trying to alter the stone and instead focused on Richard himself. They determined that cutting away his restricting clothing and shifting his body upward slightly might allow him to pass through a marginally wider section of the fissure. Using tubular webbing, strong flat nylon straps used in climbing and rescue operations, they fashioned slings that could be worked under Richard's arms. With careful coordination, they lifted him just inches higher in the crack, where the opening was slightly wider. Simultaneously, they cut away his blue jeans, removing the extra bulk that contributed to his entrapment. After 5 hours wedged between unyielding stone, Richard was finally extracted. The return of blood flow to his compressed tissues brought excruciating pain, like thousands of needles stabbing simultaneously into every cell. While Richard was carried out of the cave, the rescuers rushed towards the children and checked their condition. They needed immediate medical care, so one by one, they were taken out of the fissure, starting with those most in need of medical assistance. The experienced cave rescue team worked methodically, carrying each child through the tight passage that had trapped Richard until all 12 were out. Outside the cave, emergency medical personnel immediately treated the young explorers for hypothermia. 2 of them, the youngest ones, were immediately rushed to the hospital. Though visibly shaken by their ordeal, most of the children responded well to the initial treatment, and subsequently all of them were transported to the local hospital for thorough examination, where doctors confirmed no lasting physical damage had occurred. Though able to leave the cave under his own power, more from adrenaline than physical capability, the ordeal left Richard with lasting physical and psychological damage. For the children, the nightmare of being trapped beyond reach of help, watching their only guide and protector suspended helplessly in stone, would manifest in dreams for years to come. The incident report later emphasized that compression syndrome, hypothermia, dehydration, and oxygen deprivation had nearly claimed 13 lives that day. It also highlighted a crucial lesson. Emergency personnel, without specific cave rescue training, often underestimate the complexity of extraction from confined spaces and delay calling for specialized help. A potentially fatal mistake measured in minutes of oxygen, degrees of body temperature, and millimeters of rock. Devil's Den had nearly added 13 names to its dark history, not through malevolence, but through the simple, implacable physics of stone and flesh, and the overconfidence of a young man who didn't realize how little margin for error exists hundreds of feet below the Earth's surface, where the darkness is absolute and the stone has waited millions of years for human folly. This next story takes place underneath the surface, deep in the waters, where a cave diving expedition was meant to be doomed from the get-go. On February 26, 2002, Travis Jenkins and Dale Fisher arrived at Cove Mine with standard open water diving equipment and minimal additional gear, each carrying just a single light source, basic diving masks, wetsuits, and standard scuba tanks. Neither possessed certification or formal training in cave or cavern diving, a highly specialized discipline with strict protocols and redundancy requirements developed specifically for the unique and unforgiving hazards of overhead environments where direct access to the surface is blocked. The absence of backup air supplies, redundant lighting systems, and cave-specific navigational tools would later be identified as critical factors in the tragedy that unfolded. Their regular open water training, while sufficient for lakes and oceans with unobstructed access to the surface, had not prepared them for the complex three-dimensional environment they were about to enter. The abandoned marble mine presented a deceptive environment that lured the divers into a false sense of security. Its large, cathedral-like open chamber, with a seemingly tranquil pool of standing water, might have appeared similar to open water diving conditions. But beneath the surface lurked a treacherous network of flooded tunnels, narrow passages, and confusing side chambers. An overhead environment that demands specialized training, redundant equipment configurations, meticulous planning, and strict adherence to safety protocols developed over decades of hard-won experience in the cave diving community. The site's history as a marble extraction operation had left behind a complex labyrinth of human-made passages that intersected with natural karst formations, creating a particularly disorienting underwater maze that even experienced cave divers approached with caution. The 2 divers entered the water, with Jenkins handling a dive reel, a critical piece of equipment used to maintain a continuous guideline back to the entry point, serving as a lifeline in environments where visibility can rapidly deteriorate. They descended into the main pool within the large chamber, the solitary beam from their single lights cutting through the darkness, casting eerie shadows across the submerged rock formations. The water temperature hovered around 55 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough to affect judgment and manual dexterity during extended exposure, particularly in divers not wearing adequate thermal protection for prolonged immersion in such conditions. Inside the flooded mine, visibility was already compromised by fine sediment that naturally collects in such still, undisturbed waters. A mixture of marble dust from the mining operations and organic matter that had accumulated over decades. Even minor fin movements could stir this delicate sediment layer, rapidly reducing visibility from feet to inches, in a phenomenon cave divers call silt out. As they proceeded deeper into the submerged section of the mine, Jenkins paused briefly to address an issue with the dive reel, which had jammed due to improper spooling, a common problem for those unfamiliar with the specialized equipment. This momentary distraction, lasting perhaps only seconds, proved critical in the chain of events that followed, highlighting how quickly situations can deteriorate in environments that offer no margin for error. When Jenkins looked up again, after clearing the reel mechanism, Fisher was nowhere to be seen in the increasingly murky water. In the dim light, with rapidly deteriorating visibility caused by their own movements disturbing the fine sediment, visual contact had been lost between the diving partners. Jenkins searched the immediate area, but found no sign of his diving partner, calling out underwater and shining his light in different directions to no avail. The lack of a properly deployed continuous guideline meant that Fisher, if disoriented, had no tactile reference to follow back to the entry point, a fundamental safety protocol in overhead environment diving that had been compromised by the equipment malfunction. Outside the mine, Jenkins emerged alone from the water, visibly distressed and urgently seeking help from bystanders. He contacted emergency services via a cell phone kept in their vehicle, and rescue divers were quickly dispatched to the scene from neighboring counties with cave rescue capabilities. These professional cave rescue divers, trained specifically for such challenging environments and equipped with redundant air supplies, multiple light sources, and specialized equipment, faced significant challenges as they entered the water. The sediment disturbed by the earlier dive and subsequent search attempts had reduced visibility to near zero in many areas, forcing the rescuers to conduct a methodical, tactile search, while maintaining constant contact with their own guidelines to ensure their safe return. Multiple search attempts were made throughout the day and into the evening, with rescue divers working in increasingly dangerous conditions to locate Fisher. The operation involved coordination between multiple agencies, including local fire departments, specialized cave rescue teams, and the county sheriff's office. Eventually, the search had to be temporarily suspended to allow the sediment time to settle, as continuing in zero visibility posed serious risks to the rescue divers themselves. A difficult decision that weighed heavily on the incident commander, but reflected the reality that additional lives could not be risked in conditions where effective search was impossible. When conditions improved slightly the following morning, rescue divers returned to the mine and eventually located Fisher's body in a narrow side tunnel branching off from the main chamber, approximately 130 feet from the entry point and at a depth of about 60 feet. He had somehow separated from Jenkins and entered one of the overhead passages, likely becoming disoriented in the low visibility and running out of air while attempting to find his way back to the main chamber. A tragic scenario that has claimed numerous divers in overhead environments where direct access to the surface is blocked by rock. In the aftermath, Travis Jenkins defended their preparation to local reporters gathered at the scene and in subsequent interviews. He claimed they had received verbal permission from the city of Jasper to explore and map the mine as part of a personal project to document abandoned mining sites in the region. More controversially, he maintained that they were properly trained and equipped for the dive, arguing that they hadn't been cave diving because they had only planned to explore the open pools rather than deliberately entering the tunnels. This distinction would become a central point of contention in the subsequent investigation and discussion within the diving community. Experienced cave divers and recovery personnel viewed these statements with concern and professional disagreement. The distinction Jenkins drew between diving in the open pools versus the tunnels overlooked a fundamental safety principle established through decades of similar incidents. Any dive in an overhead environment where direct vertical access to the surface is blocked falls under specialized cave or cavern diving protocols requiring specific training, equipment, and procedures. The presence of a single light per diver rather than the minimum 3 recommended for overhead environments, the lack of redundant air supplies configured for independent function, The absence of continuous guidelines properly deployed, and most importantly, the absence of formal training in overhead environment procedures all pointed to a significant gap between the divers' preparation and the environment they chose to enter that February morning. The Cove Mine incident stands as a stark reminder of how quickly conditions can deteriorate in underwater environments, particularly when standard open water diving practices are applied to overhead settings with their unique challenges and hazards. Despite Jenkins' retrospective assurances that they weren't in over their heads, the outcome suggested otherwise. One experienced diver lost. Rescue personnel put at considerable risk during recovery operations, and a preventable tragedy that echoed through both the local community and the cave diving world for years to come. The incident was subsequently incorporated into cave diving training programs as a case study highlighting the importance of proper training, equipment configuration, and adherence to established protocols. The flooded passages of Cove Mine continue to hold their secrets, disturbed occasionally by properly trained exploration teams who enter with the equipment, training, and respect that such environments demand. Lessons purchased at the highest possible price by those who came before, and a silent testimony to the unforgiving nature of underwater exploration in overhead environments.